Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Mike Hanna. In recent weeks, much of the focus has been about Syria's chemical weapons. But with shifting alliances among opposition factions, the situation has just become a lot more complex. On September the 24th, 13 of the rebels' most powerful groups withdrew their recognition of the Syrian National Coalition and proposed the formation of a new opposition coalition bound by the view that Sharia should be the only source of legislation in a new Syria. These groups include the Tawhid Brigade and the Nusra Front, which controls tens of thousands of fighters. Significantly, it also includes several factions of the Free Syrian Army. And on September the 29th, a number of rebel factions fighting in the outskirts of Damascus formed a new body called the Islam Army, composed of some 40 groups generally regarded as religiously moderate. With apparent defections on all sides, this leaves the Free Syrian Army increasingly splintered. Well, the Syrian National Coalition, or SNC's influence on the ground was always questionable, but now it doesn't seem to have any sway at all over the armed opposition. Efforts by the head of the SNC, Ahmed Jaber, to restructure opposition forces into a national army were never really welcomed by many of those inside Syria, who described it as a Western project. The increasing levels of violence and infighting between several opposition groups has left many Syrians afraid and fearful for the future stability of their country. To clarify this and discuss the future of the Free Syrian Army, we're joined by our three guests. In Istanbul, Colonel Abdel Hamid Zakaria, spokesman for the Free Syrian Army. In Paris, Fawaz Gerges, a professor of Middle East politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. And in Beirut, Robert Fisk, Middle East correspondent for the British newspaper The Independent. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with you, Robert Fisk. You wrote a report recently saying that officials from a faction of the FSA held a meeting with officials of the al-Assad government in Damascus. You were very specific, saying that it was two officials from the FSA from the Aleppo region who had this meeting. How significant was it?
Well, if it's the first time you've heard about it, it was highly significant, as we journalists like to say. In fact, there have been talks going on between government army officers and officers within the FSA in various towns, including Qusayr since its recapture by the regime. Local ceasefires, sometimes to talk, sometimes to find out what both sides are thinking, the army and the former, of course, the present defectors, the former army officers, sometimes for the exchange of bodies, Syrian government soldiers' bodies to come back to government-held territory. In return, the FSA have received supplies, fuel, food from the regime. So, in fact, these contacts have been going on for a long time, but this is the first time any kind of formal meeting has taken place. One of the two civilians, I understand, was a lawyer. The meeting, they came down under presidential guarantee of safety to Damascus from the Aleppo region, representing several factions of the FSA in both Aleppo and Idlib. They came down on the 14th of August to Damascus and met actually with the Brigadier General on the staff of Bashar al-Assad's regime. They came down with four basic points that they wanted to make. Firstly, that there must be an internal Syrian dialogue, i.e. they didn't want foreigners involved. That certainly wouldn't do any harm in the ears of Bashar al-Assad. That private and public properties must be protected. In other words, no more burning of police stations, no more taking of private properties belonging to civilians. That there must be an end to and condemnation of all ethnic strike. In other words, get rid of the sectarian element in the battle. And on top of that, that there must be the supremacy of law in a future Syria. Very quickly, within hours, the reply came back from the presidential advisors that there should indeed be a dialogue within the Syrian homeland, that was the phrase used, that there were no preconditions for a future dialogue, and a presidential guarantee of safety for any FSA men coming down from the north or elsewhere in non-government controlled areas to talk. They would be under safe guarantees from the presidency. The one thing that both sides have clearly agreed on is that there should be no discussion at the moment of the presidency itself, whether Bashar has to go or not, which I'm sure certainly commends itself to Bashar himself. That is what's happened so far. In addition to that, I've learned that in certain institutions of the government in Aleppo, in non-government held areas or rebel controlled areas, like schools, employees are now going to be paid again by the government, and are being paid at the moment, some of them. That students who've gone across to the militias and are carrying weapons would give up their weapons and return to college. These are very small steps, and we've had a lot of steps like this before in Syria which have proved to be not false but just fatal. They haven't come off, they didn't work. And certainly I understand that within the FSA itself, and certainly within the rebel controlled areas, particularly in areas controlled by the Nusra Front, there are great objections to these talks actually taking place.
Well, at this point, Robert, let's go directly to Colonel Abdul Hamid Zakaria from the FSA and ask him, first of all, were you aware that these contacts took place, and did they do so with the FSA's authority?
Good evening to you and your guests. When I read the report in Arabic, I thought for the first moment that it was a fabricated report by Robert Fisk. However, when I revisited the English report in the independent newspaper, I was totally shocked that a newspaper at that caliber would publish such a false, groundless, baseless report. With all due respect to Mr. Fisk, I highly criticize and deny and refute the report categorically, in whole and in part. The report says that the dialogue took place in Damascus. It defies logic that officers from the FSA would go into Damascus, the stronghold of Damascus, where we cannot feel safety for innocent unarmed civilians. How about army and Free Syrian officials? Then the report speaks of public and private property, and here we ask, is there any property left to be safeguarded? Thousands of schools and makeshift hospitals were destroyed. More than 2 million households were leveled to the ground. About 3 million homes are partially destroyed, and the total shock is when we hear that the dialogue did not address the issue of the future of Assad, and here we say the entire revolution was sparked in the first place to topple al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad has slaughtered more than 150,000 innocent civilians. More than 1,500,000 people were kidnapped. 9,000 children among those who have fallen. How can we engage in dialogue with such a murderous regime? The bottom line, we categorically deny the report. Yes, there could be certain isolated incidents of communications, like swab of dead bodies or swab of captured army high-ranking officers with thousands of detainees. However, I deny the report.
Well, let's go to Fawaz Gagas on that particular point here. We do have an acknowledgement that there are some forms of contact which are dictated by conditions within what is an ongoing war, but the possibility of this type of dialogue, we've had the categorical denial, we've had the report that officials took part in this dialogue with or without the authority, clearly without the authority of the FSA, according to Colonel Zakaria. This type of situation, is it not indicative of the degree of confusion that exists at this point in time in terms of what can and cannot be done on a negotiating front?
Well, I mean, the situation is very chaotic, extremely unruly. You have, as we know, more than 1,000 armed factions inside Syria trying to topple the Syrian government. The Syrian government has been trying in the last year or so to co-opt some of the armed factions in some parts near Damascus, in Homs, in Aleppo and other places. It has gone to great lengths to try to basically convince some of the armed groups that it's willing to talk and willing to give them, all, of course, immunity. The big question really is whether the contacts that Mr. Robert Fisk basically talk about are basically by some local commanders, or whether basically given a consent by the centralized leadership of the Free Syrian Army. I doubt it very much whether the centralized leadership, the Free Syrian Army, would ever give its consent to such basically communication and contact with the regime. It really would exacerbate and aggravate basically its strategic and operational position, given now that the many Islamist factions are challenging the authority of the National Coalition and the Free Syrian Army. And there have been some minor contacts in many parts of Syria regarding humanitarian questions and questions of salaries, what have you. But if this particular story is correct, and I take Mr. Fisk's word seriously, this would really represent a qualitative shift in how some elements of the armed opposition are basically behaving and acting, given the chaotic situation and also the escalation and the deterioration and the cleavages that have emerged within the armed rebels inside Syria.
Well, Robert Fisk, we've had a direct denial from the head of the FSA that it approved any form of this dialogue, saying that it never would under any circumstances unless it dealt with the departure of al-Assad. Yet you did not say necessarily that they did have the authority of the FSA, did you? You did speak about 2 officials linked to the FSA.
Look, a considerable amount of FSA fighters are involved in supporting this particular delegation that did go to Damascus on the 14th of August. I even have the name of the man they met. I actually have the names of the 2 men who met them, who were representing but were not members of the FSA. The truth, and it's a sad truth, is that people like General Idris and Colonel Zakaria in Turkey are totally out of touch with what is happening within the FSA inside Syria. They live in a fantasy world. Partly, of course, because it's encouraged by the Americans, partly because they feel, with good reason, that they should be the supreme, leadership, that certainly General Idris should. But unfortunately, the FSA men and their supporters in the rebel areas really don't pay much attention to them. I mean, I do go in to rebel areas around Damascus and talk to people, even though I actually enter Syria with a visa. And there is no great affection or interest in General Idris. Several armed men once said to me, this is several months ago, who is General Idris? And I think that rather summed it up. I should add, however, because I have a lot of details on this, that in the original meetings prior to these 2 men coming down to Damascus, there was great opposition, not necessarily from the FSA units that were involved, but from their supporters. Some of whom began to make at a meeting they held very sectarian comments against Shiites and Alawites, and also said that they had to insist upon the overthrow of Assad. They were against this move. But clearly there are contacts now between FSA units, not just about food, fuel, prisoner swaps, body swaps, which we've known about for some time and I've been writing about, but in a political form. You have to understand that in areas like Aleppo, where schools can restart and have been given permission to restart with the permission of local FSA units, partly of course because they want to keep the Nusra out. This is about the preservation of institutions which help the public, especially because these employees in the schools would be paid again by central government. Now this doesn't mean that it's a qualitative shift politically, it means that things are beginning to move in a different direction, and for 2 reasons. Nusra is the only real fighting unit and its affiliates from Al-Qaeda in Syria. The FSA tend to fight and then run away to fight another day. If you talk to government soldiers, I'm on the front lines sometimes, I go and talk to them, I'm there. And they say, we don't mind the FSA, we can talk to them, we tell them, maybe we're going to attack, they go away and then they come back again. But the Nusra people, they say, they fight to the death. And this is the big problem for the opposition, the armed opposition inside Syria today. When you have the people who are in many ways led by foreign fighters, as well as many Syrians are inside the Nusra, remember, despite what Bashar al-Assad would like to imagine, they're all foreign terrorists. When you have these units who are doing the real fighting, and the FSA who deep down would like some kind of accommodation, you have a split opposition. The FSA actually, as they have admitted themselves, fighting their fellow rebels in the Nusra units and being assassinated by them. You don't really have much of a unified rebel group. And when one particular unit, the original FSA, want to make contacts through their various units with the government. That is what is happening.
Well, Robert, if I may, let's just go to...
Sorry to say for Colonel Zakaria.
Yes, let's just go to Colonel Zakaria on this particular point, who actually at one stage during what you were saying there was smiling broadly. But let's move away from the merits of this discussion. And Colonel, I want to put to you the one question, if I may. The allegation of Robert Fisk that the FSA and its leaders, such as yourself, are losing contact with what is happening on the ground. Would you respond to that specific claim?
First of all, I will briefly revisit the main issue. When I read the main article in English, I felt that I am reading the Syrian Ba'ath newspaper that is glorifying Assad as a leader, though he is a murderer. I advise the Independent to change its name into the Syrian Ba'ath newspaper. We are aware that the regime is launching a huge campaign, provisioned millions of dollars to buy many media, mass media, including satellite televisions and newspapers. It is an all-out campaign to propagate the false fact that they are fighting terrorists. The only true terrorist is Al-Assad and his regime. And if he says that opposition fighters do not recognize General Idris, it means that they are operating freely. Can Mr. Fisk provide the names of the two officials who were visiting Damascus to engage in dialogue with the regime?
Robert Fisk?
Yes, but not on this program, because I've been asked to keep their names secret, mainly because they're worried that other people within the FSA will harm them. Perhaps even they're frightened of Colonel Zakaria. I don't know. What I can say, by the way, is that the regime has no money to pay anybody anything, that my newspaper would never accept that we've carried the harshest criticism of Bashar al-Assad. And really, you know, to listen to someone so out of touch as Colonel Zakaria is frankly sad.
Well, let's just listen to Colonel Zakaria at this particular point, finishing his point. Colonel?
He says that they do not recognize the command of the Chief of Staff of the Free Syrian Army, alleging that they are holding the reins of power. Those, if they are holding the reins of power, and if they have the capacity and the capability to engage in dialogue, they have no fear if their names are disclosed.
Well, let's go to Fawaz Gerges on this particular point and move this conversation on from the he said, the I deny type situation. That issue of whether the FSA leadership is losing the confidence of the people on the ground. We have seen splintering within the organization. We have seen defections, it would appear, within the organization. Is the FSA running into problems in terms of its command and control structures?
Well, I mean, there are several points here. Beyond the rhetoric and the accusations and the counter-accusations, the Free Syrian Army is pressed between Iraq and a harder place. The rock of the Assad government, and also its ideal type of toppling the Assad regime, and the harder place of the increasing power and potency of foreign fighters and their Syrian supporters under al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham, Greater Syria. The reality is the Free Syrian Army is not in a good position at this particular moment. It's very vulnerable. The odds against the Free Syrian Army, and to be fair, and this is again beyond the story itself, on the independent story, what you have is that the armed opposition is deeply fragmented and splintered along ideological, religious and social lines. On the one hand, you have the Salafi jihadis of al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. On the other hand, you have what I call religious nationalists, whether you're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and the Free Syrian Army. And this particular, fragmentation has played a key role in basically the inability of the armed opposition to basically deliver a decisive blow against the Assad regime.
Well, let's go to Colonel Zakaria on that particular point, Fawaz, and then I'll come back to you. Let's go to Colonel Zakaria on that particular point. The divisions within the opposition groups. We hear there the divisions between those fighting a nationalist battle, those fighting for the rule of law, essentially. Yet among them, too, are those who are saying that the law of a future Syria must be Sharia. How does the FSA deal with these divisions? And, in fact, is it dealing with these divisions?
To begin with, let me briefly explain what is taking place on the ground. What has taken place is not fragmentation or defection from the Free Syrian Army. What happened is that certain units declared they are opposing the Syrian coalition for the misconception that the coalition will head to Geneva II conference without clear conditions, namely the departure of Assad and bringing him together with the entourage to International Criminal Court. What's taking place in the ground of mobilization of units does not necessarily mean defection or division. I will give you an example. The Army of Islam, all the units and brigades joining under the umbrella of the Islam Army were previously operating under the umbrella of the Brigade of Islam. However, due to the increasing number, the name was changed to the Islam Army. The leader or the commander, Sheikh Aloush, is one of the top commander of the Central Command. This means that this army is operating under the umbrella of the staff of the coalition. We know that the international community and the Syrian regime wish to see the Free Syrian Army weak and vulnerable. They wish to weaken all the fighting oppositions. However, we can clearly say there are very insignificant differences. However, we all agree and united that the only enemy is the regime that must be toppled.
Well, at this particular point, let's just go to Fawaz Gerges. I see that Fawaz Gerges dying to get in there. Your opinion on what's just been said?
Mike, I mean, again, to be analytical and to be empirical, and I understand what the Colonel is saying. If I were in his position, I would say exactly what he's saying. He has basically a strategic goal. He wants to convince the Syrian people that the Free Syrian Army is basically the most important player on the ground. I don't add anything original when Ahmed al-Jarba, the leader of the National Coalition at the United Nations a few days ago, what did he say? He said that the Syrian revolution has been hijacked by foreign extremists who are trying to impose their particular worldview on the Syrian revolution. These are the words of Mr. Ahmed al-Jarba. Again, a major point to highlight here is that the Free Syrian Army does not have a large contingent of troops of its own. It's a coalition of many units and groups, and that's why when you have three major brigades, 2 weeks ago, saying they questions the legitimacy of the national coalition, and again they signed with Al-Nusra Front that does not subscribe to the original goals of the Syrian uprising in terms of diversity, in terms of democracy, in terms of the rule of law. These are serious questions, and the reality on the ground tells me that the Free Syrian Army is pressed. And by the way here, the international community does not basically want to undermine the legitimacy of the Free Syrian Army. In fact, the international community would like the Free Syrian Army to have the upper hand. The Americans, the Brits, the French are terrified of the increasing power and potency of the Salafi jihadi groups, and they have gone out of their way to give legitimacy, to provide legitimacy to the Free Syrian Army.
Well, let's just have one more point here before we conclude this discussion, and that's Robert Fisk in Beirut. Very briefly, Robert Fisk. All this debate that we're having at the moment, it would appear that things are centering around one particular issue which is very important. Can you have negotiations without the precondition that Bashar Assad will step aside?
Well, I think you have to realize that even if Assad himself was prepared to, there are ministers in his government who would not accept that. One particular minister I know, again by name, I won't name him for his sake, actually is trying to oppose this rather unprecedented meeting between representatives of the FSA and an officer in the regime. So, you know, even within the regime itself, there are considerable debates and arguments and counter-arguments and condemnations too of these contacts taking place. These are early days, but they are important days. At the end of the day, Well, you know what Bashar said yesterday: if I feel the Syrian people need me to stand for the presidency, I will. And maybe they don't, that's fine. I suspect he'll feel the Syrian people do want him to stand for the presidency. And then, of course, do you trust the elections? But, you know, it's a kind of facade going on. At the end of the day, at the moment, government forces are winning the war. And
well, at that
is,
particular point, we have to end this discussion.
Many of the American threats that we've had.
Thank you so much to all our guests. In Istanbul, Colonel Abdulhamid Zakaria; in Paris, Fawaz Gerges; and in Beirut, Robert Fisk. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs, and of course online at aljazeera.com. And if you're on Twitter, you can find me on @NJAHanna. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. Goodbye for now.